with local government elections, have you decided how you're going to decide how to vote in the local elections? Is there a party that you feel in your soul is the right party to vote for? That it is a party that, when you're in the polling booth, you know in your being that this is the right party? Or have you sat down with a pen, piece of paper, made a list of what the political parties do right and what they do wrong? I mean, for every single person, making the decision to vote is different. It's often very complex. Professor Stephen Friedman is at the Centre for the Study of Democracy at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Friedman, good afternoon to you. I mean, political parties around the world must have spent huge amounts of money trying to work out why people vote like they do over the years. Are there any ways of working it out, of why we vote as we do?
I think there are, Stephen. Thanks for the opportunity. There's no magic formula, but I think you observe the way people behave and you put two and two together and you get four. And it obviously varies from country to country. I think the reality in South Africa is that first and foremost, still, people vote their identities. And that's a fancy word for saying that people tend to vote for the party which they feel speaks for people like them, whatever the party's particular manifesto happens to be at any given time. So that's the major identification, and it's not only the obvious identifications at the national level, where over many years townships and shack settlements have voted in very large numbers for the ANC. Suburbs have voted increasingly up until the last election in large numbers for the DA. It's also there are sub-identities. I mean, an obvious example is that, if you're an evangelical Christian, you might vote for the ACDP. If you come from particular areas of the Eastern Cape, you may well vote for the UDM and so forth. But there are some other signs that we have. And here I'm thinking particularly of people who live in poverty. Some colleagues of mine at UJ have done some very important work on attitudes in shack settlements. And I think, to sum up my interpretation of what is going on there, beyond the identity issue, social grants are immensely important to people. And they continue to vote for the governing party because they believe, rightly or wrongly, that another party would not continue the grants program. But there's an interesting calculation which goes on there, because people are aware of corruption and they're aware of mismanagement and they don't like it. But they seem to be saying, in effect, that they will put up with a certain amount of it in order to continue receiving the grants. But there is a tipping point, and I think we saw some of that, for example, in the 2016 local election, in which at least some people in that position said, it doesn't, the calculation just doesn't work for me anymore. The negatives outweigh the positives. But remember also that many South Africans who are disenchanted with their political parties don't switch to another political party. They simply drop out. They simply don't vote. And that shows how strong those identities really are.
I mean, there's a tendency, I suspect, in our democracy, and I think in other democracies, the United States come to mind, that if someone feels that they're going to vote for their party, they speak to someone else who votes for another party and make the claim that that person is not being logical. They accuse them of being emotional. So an example might be someone who voted for Joe Biden will look at someone who voted for Donald Trump and say, you're being emotional, you're voting your identity as, say, a sort of low working class white person. In South Africa, people in the suburbs might point to someone in a township and say, you're not, why are you voting for the ANC, etc., and use the same kind of argument. There's a sort of snootiness or elitism to the way that people actually discuss this.
Yes, there is. And there's also a lot of elitism in the way in which many academics write about it and many people comment on it. And it's an elitism which says that if you vote for a party because you identify with it, you're not being logical. You ought to behave like some kind of computer which weighs the costs and benefits. Of course, what makes this ridiculous, to be lie is that depending on what our gut feel is, our computer tells us different things. So to take your example, the computer of the Trump voter is different to the computer of the Biden voter. And what this is telling us is something rather important, which is that all voters are logical and all voters are illogical. And what I mean by that is that if you think logic is being like a calculator, then no voters are like calculators. If you think that it's a complicated process of identifying with a party or not identifying with a party, then that's perfectly logical. To vote for the ANC because you think it's the party of liberation is logical. To vote for the DA because you think it cares about suburban people is logical. So I think that it is a form of arrogance to impose on people a particular way of thinking, which the people who are doing the imposing don't actually share. People who, academics and political activists who make these kind of claims don't think that way themselves.
So if identity is a key factor, and I completely accept that, then what does that say around people who change who they vote for? So we saw, for example, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, many people in KwaZulu-Natal voted for the IFP, but then from 2009 onwards, they voted for the ANC, and perhaps are turning back again to the IFP. In 2009, over 1 million people voted for COPE, and in 2014, virtually no one did. Many people voted for the DA for years, and then it seems 100,000 of them or so moved to the Freedom Front Plus in 2019. So if people change who they're voting for, does that mean the way they think about it's changed? Does that mean that their identity may actually have changed? Because identity is not, it's not static. It does move too.
Yes, identity does move, but I don't think that's why people change their votes. I think people change their votes because their understanding of who represents their identity changes. Now, you mentioned COPE, for example. COPE is a very good example of what I'm talking about. It was called Congress of the People. It wanted to call itself something even closer to the ANC. It was called Congress of the People because it was trying to send a message that if you're a real ANC voter, the kind of person who would have been to the Congress of the People in 1956, you're really going to vote for COPE. You're not going to vote for the ANC. And that worked with about 1 million people, as you pointed out. But people tend to move to parties which can also credibly represent their identity. So that for a white Afrikaans-speaking voter who went to the DA because it felt and that the DA was representing white Afrikaans speakers better than the old National Party was doing, it makes sense if you're unhappy with the DA to go to the Freedom Front because they're a continuation of that kind of identity. If you're a person classified coloured under apartheid and you're unhappy with the DA, then it makes sense to vote for Patricia de Lille's Good Party because that's another vehicle of that sort of identity. I think you'll watch, if we look at electoral trends over the last 27 years, we see that when people do shift, they shift to parties which they think represent their identity better than the party that used to represent their identity. So that the identity vote hasn't shifted. Where you have people, as I said earlier, where you have people taking these decisions on other grounds, like the people in shack settlements fed up with corruption and mismanagement, they tend to express themselves by staying away rather than by voting for another party, because that means that they're still within their identity.
Professor Stephen Friedman, the Centre for the Study of Democracy at the University of Johannesburg. Thank you. Really just scratching the surface of a very important, very interesting conversation.